Street photography, my first photography love and what really got me upskilled in the craft of it. And while I can talk all day about the skills involved and all of that wonderful stuff, today we're going to be talking about what lenses are good to use in street photography and how to select the best one. This is the next installment in my Beginner's Guide series, a series teaching creative skills for the new content creator. Last time we talked about the most important composition rule in photography, and this time, and over the next few videos in this series, we're taking a little bit of a detour and we're talking more about how to pick the best lenses for different purposes and different genres of photography. Now, if you want to fast track to learning all there is to know about the creative skill of photography, then check out my 30-day photography fundamentals course, which I will leave a link to in the description box below. Okay, this video is going to be broken down into 4 sections. We're going to talk first about focal length considerations, then how to choose the aperture for your lenses, whether or not to then pick a zoom or a prime lens, and then I'm going to give you some of my personal recommendations for you at the very end of the video. Now, just before we get into that, know that with street photography, and I guess it's with all photography really, there is no hard and fast rule. There is no right or wrong answer for any of this stuff. There is just degrees of ease, really. The gear you have, right now could be the best thing for you. So don't feel compelled to, rush out and go and buy the latest and greatest thing, because you can shoot a great street image with any focal length, and what you end up deciding on highly depends on the style of street photography that you will end up doing. And because in street, there is so many different styles of it. You can take candids, you can do street portraits, you can do more architectural stuff that shows the environment that humans live in. You can do far away shots, you can do close-up shots, styles of, shots that show emotion, styles that show none at all. It's all fair game. Just follow where your interests take you. Let's talk about focal lengths though, because I think that's where people get stalled up the most in my opinion. So let's start with the wide end and then we can work our way all the way up to the tele end of things. So at the wide end, anything from 10 and below, although you're probably not going to go that wide, anywhere from 10 to 20 is going to be your super wide focal lengths. And this is going to be pretty much the most difficult style of street photography, unless you're doing more architecture-based street with small subjects and big places and big facades and those kind of things. This style of street is more of a documentation about how people live and perhaps the aesthetically interesting places in which they choose to live in. And it is rare that you will find images where a human takes up the majority of the frame with such a wide lens, even though if you do pull that off, it is most certainly a pretty interesting look. From there, stepping up a little bit, anything between 20 to 24 would be, in my book, considered to be normally wide. And this is a range that is definitely, more context driven again. And because of how wide it is, it really is very difficult to have a human take a large part of the composition unless you've got the bravado to get super duper close to other people and shoot them point blank in the face, which some people do. Stepping up again and very close to this, the focal lengths of 35, 40, 50 are especially common, and the standouts among those being specifically 35 and 50. These focal lengths are considered to be more of the natural focal lengths, focal lengths that most humans can relate to and perceive to be normal. Where focal lengths such as 14 or 200 millimeters produce images that are either wider or have more compression than our human brains can really imagine. These normal focal lengths are easier to relate to. They are the focal lengths that encompass most styles of street photography as well. And as a sidebar, as photographers, as we progress in our skill of our craft, we see the world in certain focal lengths that are comfortable and familiar to us. We're able to eventually quickly imagine what a composition might look like in our mind's eye. And as we get better and better as photographers, the delta between what you think an image will turn out in your mind's eye versus the actual image that you end up taking will become smaller and smaller and smaller until they become the same thing. And this skill is tremendously easier with focal lengths such as 35 and 50 millimeters. Having this skill means that you can start to preemptively react and move towards certain scenarios that are going on around you. And as you spend more and more hours out on the street, you realize that humans are really predictable. We all move in the same ways, we flow in the same directions, we repeat the same actions day in, day out, and it is this predictability that helps us capture our subjects in the field with more ease and precision. And when you can envision a composition and envision what it's going to look like in the next 2 seconds when you're in the field, because you've seen people walk past a crosswalk before with a certain gait in their stride, or because the time of day allows them to do that, or what have you, whatever the case may be, you give yourself more opportunity to nail the shot or to make the decision not to even take the shot at all. That's really important as well. In my opinion, learning the 35 and 50 millimeter focal lengths and being able to see the world with this focal length or with either of those focal lengths is an invaluable skill. Okay, the next one. Another one of my favorites, the 85 millimeter focal length. So I've been using 85 for a very, very long time, ever since I started street the very first time, really. It is a focal length that allows you to be far enough away where you're not disturbing people and you can capture those candid moments, but also not too far away that you're completely disconnected from what's going on in the scene. Now, when I shoot 85, I personally use it shooting at f1.4 pretty much all the time. So a very, very shallow depth of field. And I'll cover the reason for that in just a little bit. But it is this unique combination, 85, 1.4, that gives a very unique look that was actually largely unachievable by photographers of old. Focusing technology nowadays has become so good at being able to pinpoint, lock on, and just track just about anything. Focus has become so easy if you know the right settings with a modern camera these days. And in this way, this is a great example of how the genre of street photography has actually progressed. More on that in just a little bit when we talk about Aperture. Okay, moving on. For me personally, I wouldn't recommend shooting street with anything longer than perhaps 105 millimeters. When you start to get really far away, really long taily lengths, you become really disassociated with the scene and disconnected with your subjects just because of the sheer distance between you. But that being said, again, you can make most any focal length work, and if your subjects or compositions are actually really far away, then you actually might be able to pull it off quite well. But it is definitely more of an effort and does take a little bit of getting used to. Okay, if you're enjoying this video so far, I would really appreciate it if you would hit that like button for me so that I know it's good enough to make even more free content just like this in the future. Okay, let's talk about what kind of aperture to get for our street photography lenses. Remember that aperture controls how much of the image will be in focus. It controls how large or how small our depth of field is. And here's the thing, street photographers of old had this saying, f8 and be there. They would pretty much lock their apertures to f8 so that they could obtain a very deep depth of field and get everything in focus. And back in the day, before modern autofocus, this was the way to ensure that your subjects were going to be sharp throughout your entire composition. Now, this isn't a video on depth of field or hyperfocal distancing, but all this to say that now, with modern cameras and modern autofocus, you can pretty much use any aperture and be okay in most situations. Of course, the best focus is not needing to focus at all, don't get me wrong, but like I mentioned in the 85mm section previously, I've shot most of my street photography images on the 85 1.4. And every single generation of camera that I've had that lens on has been fast enough for me. And so with Aperture, whatever you have is probably good enough. You know, if you have a lens with an aperture of f4 or f5.6, sure, you're probably not going to get any bokeh or out of focus blur, but you will have the advantage that most things will probably be in focus and it will be slightly easier to shoot with because of that. And that leads me perfectly on to the next thing to talk about, primes versus zooms. In my opinion, honestly, with street photography specifically, if you can handle the weight, right, zooms are a fantastic place to start for beginners. I think that having the flexibility to change your focal lengths on the fly is very, very useful for beginning to understand what you like to shoot and how you like to shoot it. And if you have a zoom lens with, let's say, a 24 to 70 focal range on it, you can set yourself little challenges and force yourself to shoot only with the lens zoomed in to 35 millimeters, for example. And you can stick to it for a day and you can see how it feels like. And then the next day you could go out and shoot only in 50 millimeters, for example. And you might find that you like shooting at one focal length over another focal length, or you might find that you love having the versatility of having many focal lengths at your disposal whenever you need it. On the other side of the fence, street photography, perhaps more so than any other kind of photography, requires a lot of walking. A lot of walking also means that if you're carrying a lot of weight on your backpack, then, you know, when you're out in the field, you're probably on a timer and, you know, you're probably going to have a limited time that you could last out there with such a heavy backpack. And this is, you know, one of the major advantages of prime lenses, in that primes are almost always significantly lighter than zooms, and it's not uncommon to see street photographers go out with just one lens and one body and be able to last all day because they're not carrying anything. Add to the fact that, you know, not carrying around gigantic lenses most certainly makes you less conspicuous. And in street photography, you know, aperture doesn't matter as much as it does in some other genres of photography. You know, those two things combined, suddenly you might see the reason why street photographers prefer to run primes. But like with all things, you know, it's most certainly personal preference. And again, if I had any advice to give here for you beginners, it is that having a zoom will allow you more flexibility to find the focal ranges you like first and foremost. And from there, you can then decide if you want to get a prime for that focal length or not. And keep testing and trying out new focal lengths and keep your photography fresh and exciting and constantly growing. Okay, the last thing I wanted to talk about here is my personal setups that I use or have used in the past, with the hopes that it provides you with a little bit of motivation for some potential setups that you can try yourself as well. Starting from the smallest setup to the largest setup, my first setup is simply this. This is the RX100 Mark 7, and I know this is a video about street photography lenses specifically, and this camera doesn't have an interchangeable lens on it, but just look at how tiny this thing is. This thing has a 24 to 70 equivalent lens on it, so it provides a lot of flexibility for the size that it is. Along the same vein, one of the focal lengths that, you know, I absolutely love for more than street photography, but just for every style of photography in general, is the 35 millimeter. So I use the RX1R Mark II quite often, and again, for its size. You know, I also love that this camera has quite a large sensor, and so I can punch in when I need to. But when it comes to interchangeable lens cameras, my favorite setup recently has actually been the Sony a7CR with this little 40mm f2.5G lens on it. It is a little bit bigger than the RX1R, but you know, it is very similar to the 35mm focal length at 40mm. And I've been using it for absolutely everything. And also the reason why I use the R series of cameras from Sony is that, you know, having a lot of megapixels reduces the burden of using prime lenses just a little bit, because I'm more than happy to, APS-C punch in from 61 megapixels down to 26 megapixels, which means with this setup, I can go from 40 millimeters to 60 millimeters with a single button press. And the last setup I have and have been using is the Sony A1 and the 85 millimeter f1.4 G Master. I use the A1 for its tenacious autofocus and super fast burst rate. And then the G Master 85 just gives such a wonderful, unique look that I absolutely adore for street photography and have for many years. Now, I know all of this is top-end gear stuff, but you could easily replicate this look with something like, an APS-C camera like the Sony a6700, and then the 55 millimeter f1.8 Zeiss, and honestly, they would look very, very similar as well. But that's it. These are my recommendations for lenses for street photography, as well as a little bit of advice from my own personal setups as well. And remember that there's no real right or wrong answer here. Just experiment and find out what works best for you and what you gravitate towards. Let me know in the comments below what kind of lens setup you use and return to, and hopefully we can all give each other ideas on what we all use and inspire each other moving forward. Okay, I'll see you in the next video, but until then, get out there and make something that matters. Peace.